Behind the golden gates of Windmere Palace, where every smile is scrutinized and every gesture analyzed by millions, a single moment of unguarded childhood innocence was about to spark the biggest family crisis the monarchy had seen in decades. What started as a grandmother's attempt to capture a precious memory would soon threaten to expose the carefully guarded private world of the royal family, leading to a confrontation that would echo through the marble halls and change their relationships forever. The afternoon sun filtered through the towering windows of Windmere Palace's east wing, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Lady Victoria Ashworth, the Queen Consort, moved quietly through the ornate corridors, her silk heels clicking softly against the stone. In her manicured hand, she clutched her smartphone, its rose gold case catching the light as she approached the children's playroom. Today was different. Today, she had decided to document something special. For months, Victoria had watched her step-grandson, Prince Alexander, struggle with the weight of royal expectations. At just 8 years old, the boy already carried himself with the practiced composure of someone twice his age. But in recent weeks, she had noticed something troubling. The spontaneous laughter that once filled the palace halls had grown quieter. The mischievous sparkle in Alexander's eyes seemed dimmed by the constant presence of tutors, protocol officers, and security personnel. Victoria paused outside the playroom door, listening to the rare sound of genuine childish giggles emanating from within. Through the slightly ajar door, she could see Alexander on his hands and knees, completely absorbed in building an elaborate castle with his wooden blocks. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his formal clothes slightly wrinkled from play. For once, he looked like what he truly was, a little boy. This was the moment she wanted to preserve, not the stiff formal photographs that would grace magazine covers and official portraits, but this genuine, unguarded instance of childhood joy. The media had been particularly harsh lately, criticizing every aspect of how the young prince was being raised. Some called the royal family too strict, others claimed they were too lenient. Victoria wanted proof that beneath all the ceremony and protocol, Alexander was still allowed to be a child. She raised her phone and began recording. "Look at this magnificent fortress, Your Highness," she whispered, zooming in as Alexander carefully placed a tiny flag atop his creation. The boy looked up, startled by her voice, and for a moment, his formal training kicked in. He began to straighten his posture, preparing to offer the requisite bow. "No, no, darling," Victoria said softly, still filming. "Just play. Pretend I'm not here." Alexander's confusion was evident on his face. Throughout his young life, he had been taught that cameras meant formality, that recording devices required perfect behavior. The concept of being filmed while simply playing was foreign to him. Slowly, tentatively, he returned to his blocks, but his movements were now self-conscious, mechanical. Victoria continued recording, hoping to capture something more natural. She moved closer, angling the phone to get a better view of Alexander's intricate creation. The castle was impressive. Multiple towers connected by walls, with tiny wooden soldiers stationed at various points. It was clear the boy had inherited the family's strategic mind. "Tell me about your castle, Alexander," she prompted gently, still recording. "Who lives there?" The young prince looked up again, this time with a hint of his natural enthusiasm returning. "It's not just any castle, Grandmother Victoria. It's a fortress for the Dragon Knights. They protect the kingdom from the Shadow Riders who come from the Dark Mountains." As Alexander began explaining his imaginary world, Victoria felt her heart warm. This was what she wanted to capture: the creativity, the innocence, the pure imagination that the public never got to see. She moved the phone closer, making sure to get clear audio of his animated explanation. "The Dragon Knights have a special power," Alexander continued, his voice growing more excited. "They can speak to real dragons, and the dragons help them fly over the enemy armies. And the leader, Sir Galahad, has a magic sword that can cut through any armor." Victoria smiled, continuing to film as Alexander became more animated, using different voices for his various characters, and making swooshing sounds as he flew toy dragons around his castle. This was pure gold, authentic footage of the future king simply being a child, using his imagination, creating stories. She was so absorbed in the recording that she didn't notice the soft footsteps in the corridor behind her. "The best part," Alexander was saying, now completely engrossed in his story, "is that Sir Galahad has a secret identity. During the day, he's just a regular person, but at night, he becomes the greatest knight in the kingdom. Nobody knows except his trusted dragon, Ember. Victoria found herself genuinely engaged in the story, lowering her phone slightly as she listened. There was something profound about Alexander's tale, a young boy creating a story about someone with a secret identity, someone who lived a double life between their public and private selves. The parallels to his own future weren't lost on her. "And what happens when people discover Sir Galahad's secret?" Victoria asked, still recording but now more focused on the conversation than the camera work. Alexander paused, considering the question seriously. Well, some people would try to use his secret against him, but his real friends, the ones who truly care about him, they would help protect his secret, because they know that everyone needs a place where they can just be themselves. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. In his innocent way, Alexander had articulated something profound about royal life, the constant need to maintain public facades while desperately seeking authentic human connection. She realized she needed to capture more of this wisdom, this unexpected depth from someone so young. She raised the phone again, making sure the recording was clear. "That's very wise, darling. Tell me more about Sir Galahad's friends." But as Alexander opened his mouth to continue his story, a shadow fell across the doorway. Victoria turned to see Marcus Sterling, the head of palace security, standing in the corridor. His expression was neutral, but she could sense his disapproval. Marcus was a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the royal family, and he viewed unauthorized recordings as potential security threats. "Your Majesty," Marcus said formally, stepping into the room. "I wasn't aware there was a scheduled documentation session today." Victoria felt her cheeks flush. She had been so caught up in the moment that she had forgotten the strict protocols surrounding any recordings of the royal children. Every photograph, every video, every piece of media featuring the young royals had to be approved through multiple channels. There were security considerations, privacy concerns, and carefully managed public relations strategies to consider. "This isn't official documentation, Marcus," she said, lowering her phone but not stopping the recording. "I was simply capturing a private family moment." Marcus's eyes flicked to Alexander, who had gone quiet and was watching the adult conversation with the practiced stillness of a child accustomed to being discussed rather than included. The security chief's expression softened slightly when he looked at the young prince, but his voice remained firm when he addressed Victoria. "Your Majesty, you understand the protocols. Any recordings of Prince Alexander must be cleared through the appropriate channels. The security implications, Victoria interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "He's playing with blocks in his own home. What possible security threat could there be in documenting a child's imagination?" The tension in the room was palpable. Alexander had abandoned his castle and was now sitting quietly, his small hands folded in his lap, watching the adults argue about him as if he weren't there. This was exactly the kind of moment Victoria had hoped to avoid. Another instance of adult concerns overshadowing a child's simple pleasure. Marcus maintained his professional composure, but Victoria could see the conflict in his eyes. He understood her intentions, but his job was to think of worst-case scenarios, to imagine how any piece of media could be manipulated, taken out of context, or used against the royal family. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "in the wrong hands, even innocent footage can be problematic. The audio quality is quite clear, and Prince Alexander's comments about secret identities, about people using secrets against others, taken out of context. Such statements could fuel conspiracy theories or be misinterpreted by the media." Victoria looked down at her phone, still recording, then back at Marcus. She hadn't considered how Alexander's innocent story about dragon knights and secret identities could be twisted by creative journalists or conspiracy theorists. The modern media landscape was ruthless in its ability to find hidden meanings in the most benign statements. Furthermore, Marcus continued, the palace's social media and communications teams have specific strategies for any public-facing content involving the royal children. This footage, if it were to somehow become public, could undermine months of careful planning. Victoria felt a wave of frustration wash over her. Every aspect of their lives was managed, planned, strategized. Even a grandmother's desire to capture a precious moment with her grandson had to be filtered through committees and security assessments. She looked at Alexander, who was now staring at his unfinished castle with the resignation of someone far older than his years. "I understand your concerns, Marcus," she said finally, "but I have no intention of making this public. This is for my personal collection, a family memory." Marcus nodded respectfully, but his expression remained troubled. "Your Majesty, with respect, personal devices can be compromised, cloud storage can be hacked. Even the most secure personal files have been known to surface unexpectedly. The recent incidents involving other royal families' private photographs becoming public have heightened our security protocols considerably." Victoria knew he was referring to several high-profile cases where private family moments had been stolen from personal devices and sold to tabloids. The thought of Alexander's innocent playtime becoming fodder for public consumption made her stomach turn. Still, she hesitated to delete the recording. The footage was beautiful, genuine and pure in a way that staged photos could never capture. It showed Alexander as he truly was, intelligent, creative, thoughtful, but still wonderfully childlike. Wasn't this exactly the kind of authentic glimpse of royal life that the public claimed to want? "Perhaps," Marcus suggested diplomatically, "we could arrange for an official documentation session where Prince Alexander could share his stories in a more controlled environment. The palace photographers could capture similar moments while ensuring all security protocols are followed." Victoria almost laughed at the suggestion. The idea that Alexander's spontaneous creativity and unguarded joy could be replicated in an official session was absurd. The moment the formal cameras appeared, the boy would transform into his public persona, polite, composed, and carefully managed. The very authenticity that made this recording special would be lost. "No, Marcus," she said firmly. "What made this special was precisely its spontaneous nature. You can't schedule authenticity." As the adults continued their quiet disagreement, Alexander slowly stood and walked to the window. The palace gardens stretched out below, perfectly manicured and beautiful, but enclosed by high walls and patrolled by security. It occurred to Victoria that the gardens were a perfect metaphor for their lives, beautiful and privileged, but ultimately confined. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his tone becoming more urgent, "I must insist that you consider the broader implications. If this recording were to surface—" "It won't surface," Victoria interrupted, "because I'm not sharing it with anyone." "But the risk," Victoria said, her voice growing firmer, "is that we become so obsessed with controlling every narrative that we forget to live authentic lives." Alexander just shared something beautiful and profound about friendship, loyalty, and the importance of having space to be oneself. Are we really going to treat that as a security threat? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor. Victoria recognized the confident stride immediately. Prince Henry, Alexander's father and heir to the throne, was approaching. The timing couldn't have been worse. Henry had been dealing with intense pressure from Parliament regarding upcoming trade negotiations, and his mood had been notably tense all week. The last thing Victoria wanted was to add family drama to his already substantial burden. But as the footsteps grew closer, she realized there was no avoiding the confrontation that was about to unfold. She was still holding her phone, the recording still active, and Marcus was clearly preparing to brief Henry on the situation. Alexander looked up from the window, his expression a mixture of resignation and apprehension. Even at 8 years old, he had learned to read the signs of adult tension and prepare for the emotional storms that occasionally swept through palace life. Victoria made a quick decision. She would explain the situation to Henry herself, before Marcus could frame it purely as a security issue. She would make him understand that this wasn't about breaking protocol. It was about preserving the humanity of their family in an increasingly artificial world. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Victoria took a deep breath, preparing for what she knew would be a difficult conversation about the balance between public duty and private family moments in the modern age of the monarchy. Prince Henry appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the entrance to the playroom. Even in casual clothes, navy slacks and a crisp white shirt, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone born to rule. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from what Victoria knew had been a particularly grueling morning of meetings with economic advisors, and there were faint lines of stress around his eyes. "Good afternoon," Henry said, his voice carefully neutral as he took in the scene before him. His gaze moved from Victoria's tense posture to Marcus's formal stance, then settled on Alexander, who had gone perfectly still by the window. "I trust everything is well?" The question hung in the air, loaded with the weight of unspoken concerns. Victoria could see Henry's trained eye noting details. Marcus's positioning near the door suggested a security issue. Alexander's withdrawn demeanor indicated something had disrupted his playtime, and Victoria's defensive grip on her phone pointed to the likely source of the problem. "Henry," Victoria began, stepping forward slightly. "Alexander was just showing me his wonderful castle, and I thought it would be nice to capture—" "Your Royal Highness," Marcus interrupted respectfully but firmly. "Her Majesty has been recording Prince Alexander without following the established protocols. I was just explaining the security implications of unauthorized documentation." Henry's expression didn't change, but Victoria noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, a tell she had learned to recognize during the years since her marriage to his father. It was the look he got when trying to balance his personal feelings with his royal responsibilities, a constant struggle that had become more pronounced since his father's death 2 years ago had elevated him to heir apparent. "I see," Henry said slowly, moving further into the room. He approached Alexander's abandoned castle, crouching down to examine the intricate structure his son had built. "This is quite impressive, Alexander. Tell me about these dragon knights." Alexander's face brightened momentarily at his father's interest, but the joy was tempered by the obvious tension in the room. "They're protectors, father. They guard against the Shadow Riders and help people who need to keep secrets safe." Victoria saw Henry's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly at the word secrets. In the current political climate, with increasing calls for transparency in the monarchy and ongoing debates about the royal family's privacy rights, the concept of secrets was particularly sensitive. "Secrets," Henry repeated thoughtfully, still examining the castle. "And why do people need to keep secrets, do you think?" "Because," Alexander said earnestly, "sometimes people need a place where they can just be themselves, without everyone watching and judging. The Dragon Knights understand that everyone deserves privacy, even heroes." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was an 8-year-old articulating one of the central challenges of modern monarchy, the tension between public service and personal privacy. Victoria felt a swell of pride at Alexander's wisdom, followed immediately by a pang of sadness that such insights were necessary for someone so young. Henry stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. When he looked at Victoria, his eyes held a complex mixture of understanding and frustration. "Victoria," he said carefully, "might I have a word with you privately?" It wasn't really a request. Victoria glanced at Alexander, who had returned to his position by the window, and then at Marcus, who maintained his professional silence. She knew that whatever conversation was about to unfold would likely determine the fate of her recording, and possibly set a precedent for future family interactions. "Of course," she replied, following Henry into the adjacent sitting room, a smaller but equally elegant space decorated in warm golds and deep blues. Marcus remained with Alexander ostensibly to ensure the prince's safety, but Victoria suspected also to prevent any attempt to delete or hide the controversial recording. Henry closed the door behind them and stood with his back to it for a moment, collecting his thoughts. When he turned to face Victoria, she could see the weight of his position etched in every line of his face. "You know I respect your intentions," he began, his voice measured, "but I need you to help me understand what you were thinking." Victoria had prepared several arguments during the walk to the sitting room, but faced with Henry's direct approach, she found herself speaking from the heart. "I was thinking that your son is growing up in a fishbowl, that every moment of his childhood is managed and orchestrated, and that someday you might want to remember what he was really like when he thought no one was watching." Henry moved to the window, looking out at the same gardens that had drawn Alexander's attention. "And you thought the best way to preserve that memory was to record him without permission, in violation of security protocols that exist for very real reasons?" "I thought," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly, "that a grandmother should be able to capture a precious moment with her grandchild without requiring approval from a committee."
Henry turned back to her, and she could see the conflict playing out across his features.
"Victoria," You're not just any grandmother. Alexander isn't just any grandchild. Every decision we make, every action we take, exists within a context that affects millions of people. I'm tired of that context, Victoria admitted, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. I'm tired of everything being about public perception and security protocols and damage control. He's 8 years old, Henry, 8, and he's already so careful, so aware of being watched, that he asks permission before laughing too loudly. The accusation hung between them, and Victoria could see that it had hit its mark. Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment, he looked less like a future king and more like a worried father. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly. "You think I don't see what this life is doing to him? Every night I watch him practice his formal greetings in the mirror. Every morning I see him choose his words carefully, even at the breakfast table. You think I don't hate that he's losing his childhood piece by piece?" Victoria felt her anger deflate, replaced by sympathy for the impossible position Henry found himself in. Then why not let him have this? Why not let there be some record of who he really is when he's allowed to just be a child? Henry ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded Victoria powerfully of his late father during moments of stress. "Because the world isn't fair, Victoria. Because a 30-second video clip of Alexander talking about secrets and hidden identities would be analyzed by every conspiracy theorist and political commentator in the country. Because loving him means protecting him, even when that protection feels like a cage." "So what's the alternative?" Victoria challenged. "We sanitize every moment, stage every interaction until there's nothing real left to protect?" Before Henry could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression more troubled than before. "Your Royal Highness," he said to Henry, "I apologize for the interruption, but we may have a more immediate problem." Victoria felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced between them before continuing. "While you've been speaking, I've been reviewing the security footage from the corridor. The recording session was observed by Sarah Chen, one of the new housekeeping staff members who was cleaning the adjacent rooms." Henry's face went pale. "How much did she see?" "Enough to potentially cause problems," Marcus replied diplomatically. "She's only been on staff for 3 weeks, and her security clearance is still provisional. More concerning, her employment application listed previous work for Celebrity Watch magazine. The implications hit Victoria like a physical blow. Celebrity Watch was one of the most aggressive tabloids in the country, known for paying substantial sums for insider information about the royal family. If Sarah Chen had witnessed the recording session and still had connections to the magazine, Victoria's innocent family moment could become front-page news within hours. "Where is Miss Chen now?" Henry asked, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used during crisis management. "I've discreetly assigned her to duties in the West Wing, away from the family quarters," Marcus replied. "She hasn't been told why, and I don't believe she's aware that her observation has been noted. However, her shift ends in 2 hours, and once she leaves palace grounds, we lose the ability to monitor her communications." Victoria sank into one of the sitting room's velvet chairs, the full magnitude of the situation beginning to dawn on her. It wasn't just about the recording anymore. It was about the possibility that a palace insider with tabloid connections had witnessed what could be spun as a security breach involving the young prince. "What are our options?" Henry asked Marcus, moving into full crisis management mode. Marcus consulted a tablet he had produced from his jacket. "We can extend Ms. Chen's shift and keep her on palace grounds while we assess the situation. We can also implement communication blackout protocols for all non-essential staff, but that would be noticeable and might actually draw more attention to the incident." "Or," Henry said slowly, looking directly at Victoria, "we can eliminate the source of the problem entirely." Victoria understood immediately. "You want me to delete the recording. I want us to consider all the implications," Henry replied carefully. "If there's no recording, then Miss Chen witnessed nothing more than a family conversation. If the recording exists, and if she somehow observed enough to understand what was happening, then we have a potential security leak involving unauthorized documentation of the heir." Victoria looked down at her phone, still clutched in her hands. The device suddenly felt impossibly heavy. You're asking me to destroy the only authentic footage that exists of your son being genuinely happy and creative. I'm asking you to consider whether preserving that moment is worth the risk of having it, and him, exploited by people who don't have his best interests at heart," Henry replied. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of palace staff going about their duties in other parts of the building. Victoria thought about Alexander's animated explanation of his dragon nights, his unconscious wisdom about the need for authentic spaces away from public scrutiny. She thought about the joy in his voice as he created elaborate stories about heroes with secret identities. "There's another option," she said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. "What if we control the narrative ourselves?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Victoria stood, beginning to pace as her thoughts crystallized. "What if, instead of hiding this moment or treating it like a security breach, we use it to show the public exactly what you want them to see? A normal family, a child who's creative and thoughtful, a grandmother who loves her grandson enough to want to preserve his childhood memories." Marcus looked skeptical. "Your Majesty, with respect, public relations strategies involving the royal children require extensive planning and consultation." "But this isn't a strategy," Victoria interrupted. "It's authentic. It's real. It's exactly what the monarchy's critics say we lack: genuine human connection." Henry was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal. Victoria could see him weighing the potential benefits against the considerable risks. "Even if we wanted to pursue that approach," he said finally, "it would require the agreement of the communications team, the security department, and ultimately the Queen herself. That process could take weeks. Weeks during which Miss Chen could sell her story to the highest bidder," Marcus added. Victoria felt the walls closing in around her again. Every path forward seemed to lead to either the destruction of her precious recording or a complex web of palace politics and security concerns. She thought about Alexander, still in the playroom with his castle, probably wondering why the adults were making such a complicated issue out of something as simple as playing with blocks. "There's something else to consider," Henry said quietly, his voice taking on a tone Victoria hadn't heard before. "Alexander's security detail reports that he's been asking questions lately about why he can't have friends over like other children, why photographers follow him to school, why he has to practice smiling in the mirror." He's starting to understand the reality of his position. Victoria's heart ached at the image of Alexander grappling with such heavy concepts at such a young age. "All the more reason to preserve moments like these," she said softly, "to remember who he was before the weight of the crown began to change him." Or, Henry countered gently, "all the more reason to protect him from having those moments dissected by strangers who will never understand what his life is really like." The philosophical difference between them was becoming clear. Victoria wanted to document and preserve Alexander's authentic childhood moments, believing they were precious precisely because they were fleeting. Henry wanted to shield those moments from outside scrutiny, believing that protection was more important than preservation. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus interrupted again, "I hate to press the matter, but Miss Chen's shift change is approaching, and we need to make a decision about how to proceed." Henry looked at Victoria, and she could see the weight of his dual roles as father and future king warring in his expression. "Victoria," he said finally, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I'm asking as Alexander's father, not as your stepson or as the heir to the throne." Victoria nodded, bracing herself for what she suspected was coming. "Will you delete the recording?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Victoria understood that this moment would define not just the fate of her video, but potentially her relationship with Henry and her role in Alexander's life going forward. If she refused, it would signal that she valued her desires over his parental authority and the security of the monarchy. If she agreed, it would mean accepting that even the most innocent family moments were subject to institutional control. She looked down at her phone one more time, thinking of Alexander's bright eyes as he explained his elaborate fantasy world, his unconscious wisdom about the importance of having spaces where people could be authentic. Then she looked up at Henry, seeing not the future king but a father trying to protect his son from a world that would never allow him true privacy. "I need a moment," she said finally. Henry nodded. "Of course. But Victoria, Whatever you decide, we need to address the Miss Chen situation immediately. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Marcus's radio crackled to life with a voice from the security control room. Sir, we have a situation. Ms. Chen was just observed in the staff quarters making a phone call. The conversation appeared animated, and she was observed writing notes. Victoria's blood ran cold. Henry's face went rigid with controlled anger. The window for managing this situation quietly was rapidly closing. Marcus, Henry said, his voice taking on the commanding tone of someone accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure. Initiate Protocol 7. I want Miss Chen detained for questioning, and I want a complete review of her communications for the past week. Yes, Your Highness, Marcus replied, already speaking into his radio to coordinate the response. Victoria watched the exchange with growing alarm. What had started as a simple desire to preserve a family memory had escalated into a full security investigation. Henry, she said urgently, surely this is an overreaction. An overreaction? Henry turned to her, and for the first time she saw real anger in his eyes. Victoria, if that recording becomes public, it won't just be entertainment news. It will be analyzed for intelligence about palace security, about Alexander's psychological state, about our family dynamics. Foreign intelligence services study our children's public statements looking for exploitable weaknesses. The scope of the implications was staggering. Victoria had never fully considered how something as innocent as a child's playtime story could be weaponized by people with hostile intentions toward the monarchy or the nation itself. I had no idea, she whispered. Of course you didn't, Henry said, his anger already cooling back into the controlled concern that was his default emotional state. How could you? But this is the reality we live with every day. This is why we have protocols, why we have security clearances, why we can't simply live normal lives. Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes, not just for the recording she was about to lose, but for the childhood Alexander would never have, for the spontaneous family moments that would always be filtered through layers of security and political considerations. The recording, she said quietly, raising her phone. You still want me to delete it? It wasn't a question anymore. The arrival of the Ms. Chen crisis had made the decision inevitable. Whatever Victoria's personal feelings about preserving Alexander's authentic moments, the potential consequences of the recording's existence now extended far beyond family dynamics. Henry looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. I want you to understand why it has to be deleted. Victoria nodded, her thumb hovering over the delete button. In that moment, she thought about all the ordinary families who could record their children without considering foreign intelligence implications, security protocols, or media exploitation. She thought about the price of privilege, the hidden costs of a crown that wouldn't touch Alexander's head for decades, but was already shaping every moment of his young life. Will you at least watch it with me? She asked quietly. Before we destroy it forever? Henry hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he said. I think we both need to see what we're giving up. Victoria and Henry settled into the high-back chairs in the sitting room, the phone positioned between them on the polished mahogany side table. The device seemed impossibly small to contain something that had caused such upheaval, yet its presence dominated the space between them like an unexploded ordnance. Before we watch this, Henry said quietly, I want you to know that I understand your motivations. When I was Alexander's age, my grandmother used to sneak me away from my security detail to feed ducks in Hyde Park. She never recorded those moments, but I treasure the memory of feeling normal, even if it was just for 20 minutes. Victoria looked at him with new understanding. She had always seen Henry as someone who had fully embraced his royal destiny, but perhaps that perception was itself a product of the careful public image management that surrounded the family. What happened to those moments? She asked. They stopped. Henry replied simply. One day, someone photographed us there with a telephoto lens from across the lake. The pictures appeared in 3 different magazines with headlines about security lapses and inappropriate exposure of the air. My grandmother was devastated and the duck feeding trips ended forever. The parallel to their current situation was unmistakable, and Victoria felt a new layer of sadness settle over her. So you've been through this before? Not exactly this, Henry corrected. But I've learned that the things we most want to protect are often the first casualties of public life. The trick is figuring out what's worth fighting for and what's simply too dangerous to preserve. Victoria touched the phone screen, bringing up the video file. The thumbnail showed Alexander mid-gesture, his small hands positioned over his castle, mouth open in explanation. Even in the still image, his enthusiasm was evident. "Are you ready?" she asked. Henry nodded, though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Play it." Victoria pressed the play button, and Alexander's voice filled the room, clear and bright with childish excitement. "It's not just any castle, Grandmother Victoria. It's a fortress for the Dragon Knights. They protect the kingdom from the Shadow Riders who come from the Dark Mountains." Watching Henry's face as he observed his son was almost more interesting than the video itself. Victoria saw the father's pride war with the heir's concern, watched him notice details she had missed in the moment, the way Alexander unconsciously straightened his posture when he thought someone was evaluating him, the careful articulation that spoke to hours of speech therapy and elocution lessons, the brief moments when he forgot to monitor himself and became completely absorbed in his story. "The Dragon Knights have a special power," Alexander continued on screen, his voice growing more excited. "They can speak to real dragons, and the dragons help them fly over the enemy armies." Henry paused the video. "Did you notice how he changed his accent there?" Victoria frowned, replaying the last few seconds in her mind. "Changed his accent? When he gets excited, his natural speech patterns come out. Listen to how he says dragons. It's not the received pronunciation we've been teaching him. It's closer to how the palace staff speak, the people he spends the most informal time with." Victoria listened more carefully as Henry restarted the video. He was right. There were subtle variations in Alexander's speech that revealed the influences of different people in his life. The formal tones when he was being careful, the warmer, more natural inflections when he was lost in his story. "And the leader, Sir Galahad, has a magic sword that can cut through any armor," Alexander continued, now using different voices for his characters and making swooshing sounds as he moved toy dragons around his castle. "This is what you wanted to preserve," Henry said softly, not really a question. "Yes," Victoria replied. "This joy, this creativity. This moment when he's just a little boy playing make-believe." They continued watching in silence as Alexander became more animated, his story growing more elaborate. Victoria found herself noticing new details, the way he carefully arranged each piece of his castle with an unconscious attention to symmetry and defense, suggesting a strategic mind already developing. The unconscious authority in his voice when he described Sir Galahad's leadership, as if he instinctively understood what it meant to bear responsibility for others. Then came the moment that had particularly struck Victoria during the original recording, Alexander's explanation about secret identities. "The best part is that Sir Galahad has a secret identity. During the day, he's just a regular person, but at night, he becomes the greatest knight in the kingdom. Nobody knows except his trusted dragon, Ember." Henry's intake of breath was sharp. Victoria paused the video and looked at him questioningly. "He's describing his own life," Henry said quietly. "The duality of public and private selves, the weight of responsibilities that others can't understand, the importance of having trusted allies who know your true self." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. Surely that's just coincidence. He's 8 years old. "Is it?" Henry asked, his voice troubled. "Listen to what comes next." Victoria restarted the video, and her own voice came through clearly. "And what happens when people discover Sir Galahad's secret?" Alexander's response was thoughtful, mature beyond his years. "Well, some people would try to use his secret against him, but his real friends, the ones who truly care about him, they would help protect his secret, because they know that everyone needs a place where they can just be themselves." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Alexander wasn't just creating a fantasy story. He was processing his own reality through the safe distance of imagination. The Dragon Knights weren't just characters in a game. They were his way of understanding concepts like loyalty, betrayal, protection, and the burden of maintaining public facades. "He knows," Henry said finally. "He understands more than we've given him credit for." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched Henry's face cycle through a range of emotions. Pride at his son's insight, sadness at the loss of innocence it represented. and something that might have been fear about what such awareness meant for Alexander's future. The video continued with Victoria asking about Sir Galahad's friends, and Alexander launching into an even more elaborate explanation of loyalty and trust within his imaginary kingdom. But now, knowing what to listen for, both adults could hear the deeper themes Alexander was working through. "You see," Alexander explained on screen, "the Dragon Knights made a promise to always be honest with each other, even when the truth is hard. Because lies, even little ones, can grow into big problems. And when you're responsible for protecting people, you have to be someone they can trust completely." Henry stopped the video again, his face pale. "That's not typical child's play, Victoria. That's sophisticated political philosophy." "He's processing what he observes," Victoria said, beginning to understand the full implications of what they were watching. All those state dinners he attends, all those meetings with advisors he sits in on, all those conversations about duty and responsibility, he's been listening and thinking and trying to make sense of it all, and expressing it through play, Henry added. Which means this recording isn't just a cute family moment. It's a window into how the future king is intellectually and emotionally developing. It's a psychological profile disguised as children's entertainment. The weight of that realization settled over them both. Victoria finally understood why Marcus had been so concerned about security implications. In the wrong hands, this footage could be analyzed by child psychologists, political scientists, and foreign intelligence analysts, looking for insights into the future monarch's character, fears, and decision-making processes. "There's more," Victoria said quietly, letting the video continue. They watched as Alexander began describing the Dragon Knight's greatest challenge, an enemy who could mimic their appearance and infiltrate their ranks, causing confusion and mistrust among the people they protected. "The hardest part," Alexander explained with surprising gravity, "is that some people pretend to be your friends just so they can learn your secrets. The Dragon Knights have to be very careful about who they trust, because betrayal doesn't just hurt them, it hurts everyone who depends on them."
Henry closed his eyes, and Victoria could see the pain in his expression.
At 8 years old, Alexander was already grappling with concepts of betrayal, manipulation, and the weight of responsibility for others' well-being. The carefree childhood that Victoria had thought she was documenting was revealed to be something far more complex. A young mind struggling to understand the isolating realities of his destined role. "He's so alone," Henry whispered, and Victoria realized he wasn't just talking about Alexander's current situation, but recognizing his own childhood reflected in his son's sophisticated play. The video neared its end, with Alexander's final, most poignant observation. "But the Dragon Knights have each other, and they have their dragons. So even when they're scared or confused, they're not really alone. They just have to remember to trust the right people and be brave enough to ask for help when they need it." When the recording finished, both adults sat in contemplative silence. What Victoria had initially seen as charming childhood creativity had been revealed as something far more profound and far more problematic from a security standpoint. "Now you understand," Henry said finally, "why this can never be public. It's not just about him playing with blocks. It's about providing a roadmap to his psychological development, his fears, his understanding of power and responsibility, and his vulnerabilities," Henry added. "Any analyst watching this could identify potential pressure points, ways to manipulate or influence him as he grows older. They could use his own words about trust and betrayal to understand how to approach him or how to hurt him." Victoria looked at the phone, now understanding that what she had seen as a precious family memory was actually a security risk of the highest order. "I had no idea that children's play could be so revealing. Most children don't grow up knowing they'll inherit the responsibility for an entire nation," Henry replied. "Most 8-year-olds aren't already processing concepts of statecraft and political loyalty. Alexander's play is different because his life is different." The sitting room door opened quietly, and Marcus appeared, his expression grave. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid the situation with Miss Chen has become more complicated." Henry straightened, immediately shifting back into crisis management mode. "What's happened?" "We've detained her as instructed, but during the initial questioning she revealed that she's already shared information about today's events with an outside contact. She claims it was innocent, just mentioning to a friend that she had observed something interesting involving the royal family. However, that friend appears to be a freelance journalist with connections to several major tabloids. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. How much did she tell them? "We're still determining that," Marcus replied. But she admits to mentioning that she observed what appeared to be an unauthorized recording session involving Prince Alexander, and that palace security seemed concerned about it. Henry was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "So, regardless of what we do with the actual recording, there's already speculation about its existence." "I'm afraid so, Your Royal Highness. We're monitoring all major news outlets for any developing stories, but given the speed of modern media, we may only have hours before something appears online." Victoria felt a wave of guilt crash over her. Her simple desire to capture a family moment had spiraled into a full-scale security crisis that was now beyond their control. "This is all my fault," she said quietly. "No," Henry said firmly, surprising her with the conviction in his voice. "This is the fault of a system that makes even the most basic family interactions into potential security threats. But we are where we are, and now we need to decide how to proceed." Marcus consulted his tablet again. "Sir, we have several options. We can get ahead of the story with a controlled release of information, acknowledging that a private family moment was recorded and explaining our position on protecting the prince's privacy. We can deny any recording took place and characterize Miss Chen's observations as mistaken. Or we can remain silent and let speculation build." "What does the communications team recommend?" Henry asked. "They're split," Marcus admitted. "Half think we should get ahead of the story, half think acknowledging any recording gives credibility to Miss Chen's account and makes us look defensive." Victoria looked down at the phone again, the video file still visible on the screen. "There's another option," she said slowly. Henry looked at her questioningly. "We could release it ourselves," she continued, the idea forming as she spoke. "Not as damage control, but as something deliberate. Show the public exactly what royal childhood looks like. Not the staged photos and formal events, but a real child working through real concepts in the safety of his own home." Marcus looked alarmed. "Your Majesty, the security implications." "I know the security implications," Victoria interrupted. "But what are the implications of looking like we have something to hide? What message does it send when we're so protective of a child's innocent playtime that we're willing to detain staff members and launch security investigations?" Henry was quiet, and Victoria could see him considering the proposal from multiple angles. "It would be unprecedented," he said finally. "So was your grandmother's decision to allow television cameras into the coronation," Victoria pointed out. "So was your father's choice to speak publicly about his personal struggles. Sometimes unprecedented is exactly what's needed." "But this involves Alexander directly," Henry countered. "He's too young to consent to such exposure. He's going to be exposed anyway," Victoria replied. "The question is whether it happens on our terms or on terms set by tabloid speculation and leaked information." Marcus's radio crackled again, and he stepped aside to take the communication. When he returned, his expression was even more grave. "Sir, I'm afraid the situation has accelerated. Celebrity Watch magazine has just published an online article titled, 'Secret Palace Recording Sparks Security Scramble.' They don't have the actual footage, but they're reporting that palace sources confirm an unauthorized recording of Prince Alexander took place today." Henry closed his eyes, and Victoria could see the weight of the monarchy settling on his shoulders in real time. In the space of a few hours, a private family moment had become a public relations crisis that would likely generate headlines around the world. "How bad is the article?" Henry asked. Marcus consulted his tablet. "It focuses primarily on security concerns and questions about palace protocol. The reporter is speculating about what might have been captured on the recording and why palace security was so concerned about it. They're also questioning why a staff member with tabloid connections was given access to the family quarters." Victoria felt sick. The article was making their family sound secretive and paranoid. Exactly the opposite of the openness and authenticity that modern monarchies needed to maintain public support. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus continued, "the communications team is now strongly recommending that we get ahead of this story. The speculation will likely be worse than any controlled release of information." Henry opened his eyes and looked directly at Victoria. "If we do this, If we release the recording, there's no taking it back. Alexander's innocent moment of play becomes public property forever. Victoria understood the weight of what he was asking her to consider. Once released, the video would be analyzed, discussed, and dissected by millions of strangers. Alexander's childish insights about loyalty and trust would become talking points for political commentators. His imaginary dragon knights would be psychoanalyzed by experts who had never met him. But the alternative, letting speculation and rumors define the narrative, seemed even worse. What if we control how it's presented? She asked. What if we provide context, explain that this is a normal family interaction, emphasize that Alexander is simply a creative child processing his world through play? Henry was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the decision. Finally, he looked up at Marcus. I need to speak with Alexander before we make any final decisions. If this recording is going to become public, he deserves to know what's happening and why. Marcus nodded. Of course, Your Royal Highness. Should I prepare a briefing for the communications team in the meantime? Yes, Henry replied. But no final decisions until I've spoken with my son. As Marcus left to coordinate the palace's response, Victoria and Henry were left alone with the phone and the weight of their choice. The innocent recording that had started as a grandmother's attempt to preserve a precious memory had become a flashpoint for questions about royal privacy, security protocols, and the price of public life. Whatever happens, Victoria said softly, I want you to know that I never intended for any of this. Henry nodded, his expression softening slightly. I know. And Victoria? What Alexander said about needing trusted people who understand the importance of having space to be yourself, that describes what you were trying to give him today. Even if the execution was flawed, the intention was pure. Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that, regardless of what happened next, this crisis had revealed something important about their family dynamics and the impossible pressures they all lived under. Should we go talk to Alexander? She asked. Henry stood, straightening his shoulders as he prepared to have one of the most difficult conversations a father could have with his 8-year-old son, explaining why a moment of innocent play had become a matter of national security and asking a child to make decisions about his own privacy that no child should ever have to consider. Henry and Victoria found Alexander exactly where they had left him, by the window in the playroom, though his elaborate castle had been carefully disassembled and the blocks neatly stacked in their storage container. The sight of the organized blocks struck Victoria as profoundly sad. Even his play had been tidied away according to protocol. Alexander looked up as they entered, his expression carefully neutral in the way that had become second nature to him. At 8 years old, he had already learned to read the subtle signs of adult stress and prepare his responses accordingly. Alexander, Henry said gently, settling into one of the child-sized chairs that furnished the playroom, we need to talk about something important. The young prince nodded solemnly and took his place in the chair across from his father, his posture unconsciously formal despite the casual setting. Victoria remained standing by the door, uncertain of her role in what was about to unfold. Do you remember the story you were telling Grandmother Victoria about the Dragon Knights? Henry asked. Yes, father. Alexander replied carefully. Did I say something wrong? The question broke Victoria's heart. That a child's first instinct would be to wonder if his innocent creativity had somehow violated expectations, spoke volumes about the pressure he lived under daily. No, darling, Henry said quickly. Your story was wonderful, creative and thoughtful, and exactly what children your age should be imagining. The problem isn't with what you said, it's with the fact that Grandmother Victoria recorded it. Alexander's eyes widened slightly, and he looked between his father and Victoria with the quick intelligence that characterized so many of his interactions. Is recording against the rules? It's complicated, Henry replied, and Victoria could see him struggling to explain adult concepts of security and privacy to someone so young. There are people outside our family who are very interested in everything we do and say. Sometimes, when they learn private things about us, they don't treat that information with the care it deserves. Alexander considered this gravely. Like the shadow riders in my story, people who might use secrets to hurt others? The parallel wasn't lost on Henry, and Victoria saw him wince slightly at his son's astute observation. Yes, Exactly like that. You understand these concepts very well. So the recording is dangerous because it shows who I really am when I'm just playing, Alexander asked. Victoria found herself amazed by the child's grasp of the situation. He had immediately identified the core issue, that authentic private moments were somehow more vulnerable than carefully managed public appearances. What do you think we should do? Henry asked, and Victoria realized he was genuinely seeking his son's input rather than simply explaining an adult decision. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his young face serious with concentration. In my story, he said finally, when Sir Galahad's secret was discovered, he had to decide whether to hide it or trust people with the truth. And what did he decide? Victoria asked softly. He chose to trust the right people, Alexander replied, because he realized that hiding made him seem guilty, even when he hadn't done anything wrong. The wisdom of the statement hung in the air between them. Victoria exchanged a glance with Henry, both of them recognizing that Alexander had articulated exactly the dilemma they were facing. But how do you know who the right people are? Henry pressed gently. Alexander considered this carefully. Sir Galahad said you can tell by how they treat your secrets when they think you're not watching. Do they protect them or use them for their own purposes? Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. The 8-year-old had just provided a more sophisticated analysis of trust and betrayal than many adults ever developed. Before Henry could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway again, his expression urgent. Your Royal Highness, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been a development. Henry looked up, immediately alert. What kind of development? The story has been picked up by International Royal Watch, and they're reporting that multiple palace sources have confirmed the existence of a recording. More concerning, they're speculating that the content of the recording may involve security-sensitive information about the royal family's private dynamics. Victoria felt her stomach drop. They're making it sound like we were discussing state secrets. Which is exactly why speculation is often more damaging than truth, Henry said grimly. He looked down at Alexander, who was listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus of someone accustomed to being discussed rather than included. Alexander, Henry said gently, the story about your dragon knights is now being talked about by people who don't know you and don't understand that you were just playing. Some of them might say things about you or our family that aren't true. Alexander's face showed no surprise, only a resignation that seemed far too mature for his age. Because they don't know the difference between Sir Galahad the character and me the person? Exactly, Henry replied, his voice heavy with sadness at his son's early understanding of media distortion. So what are our choices? Alexander asked, his question directed to both adults. Victoria was struck by his use of our. The 8-year-old had recognized that this decision would affect all of them, and that he deserved a voice in determining their response. Henry looked to Victoria, then back at his son. We can keep the recording private and let people guess about what it contains, which means they might imagine things that are much worse than reality. Or, we can show them the real recording and let people see exactly what actually happened. If we show them the real recording, Alexander said slowly, working through the implications, then everyone will know about my dragon knights and my castle and my story. Yes, Henry confirmed. It would no longer be a private moment between you and Grandmother Victoria. Alexander was quiet for several minutes, and Victoria could see him processing the choice with a seriousness that no child should have to demonstrate. Finally, he looked up at his father. Will people think badly of you and Grandmother Victoria if we don't show them the recording? The question revealed Alexander's instinctive understanding that his decisions had implications beyond himself, another sign of the premature maturity that royal life had imposed on him. Some people might, Henry admitted, they might think we're hiding something important. And if we do show them the recording, will it help them understand that our family is normal even though we're royal? Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. Alexander had identified exactly what she had hoped to accomplish with her original recording, showing the public that beneath all the ceremony and protocol, they were simply a family trying to navigate the complexities of love and responsibility. It might, Henry said carefully, but it would also mean giving up your privacy about those thoughts and feelings you shared. Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens as he considered his options. Victoria watched him, this small figure silhouetted against the ornate window, already carrying burdens that most adults would find overwhelming. When he turned back to them, his expression was resolute. "I want to show them the recording." Henry looked surprised. "Are you sure? Once we release it, we can't take it back." "I'm sure," Alexander replied with conviction, "because the truth about who I am is better than lies about who they think I might be, and because Sir Galahad would choose to trust people with the truth, even if it's scary." Victoria felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly overwhelmed her. This 8-year-old had just demonstrated more courage and wisdom than many adults ever managed. "There's one condition," Alexander continued, his voice taking on a note of authority that reminded Victoria powerfully of his grandfather. "I want to explain the recording myself." Henry frowned. "What do you mean?" "I want to talk to the cameras and tell people about my dragon knights and explain what the story means to me," Alexander said. "If they're going to see me playing and thinking, then I want them to understand it from my perspective, not from what other people guess about it." The request was unprecedented. Royal children, particularly heirs, rarely spoke publicly without extensive preparation and careful scripting. The idea of allowing Alexander to provide his own commentary on the situation was both revolutionary and terrifying from a protocol standpoint. "Alexander," Henry said carefully, "speaking to the media is very different from playing in your room. There would be cameras and reporters and questions that might be difficult to answer." "But it would be honest," Alexander replied. "And honestly is what Sir Galahad would choose." Marcus had been listening to the conversation from the doorway, and Victoria could see the conflict playing out across his features. From a security standpoint, allowing an 8-year-old heir to address the media directly was nightmare fuel. From a public relations perspective, the authenticity and courage of such an approach could be transformational for the monarchy's public image. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said hesitantly, "if we were to consider such an approach, it would require extensive preparation, media training, careful question selection, controlled environment." "No," Alexander said firmly, surprising everyone in the room. "If we're going to do this because honesty is important, then it has to be really honest, not practiced or controlled or scripted." Victoria found herself holding her breath as she watched Henry grapple with his son's unexpected wisdom and determination. The 8-year-old was essentially proposing to revolutionize royal media strategy by prioritizing authenticity over careful image management. "The risks," Henry began, "are less than the risks of pretending," Alexander finished. "The Dragon Knights taught me that courage means doing the right thing even when it's scary." Henry looked to Victoria, and she could see him weighing the unprecedented nature of what Alexander was proposing against the clear conviction in his son's voice. "If we do this," Henry said slowly, "if we release the recording and allow you to speak about it publicly, it changes everything. Not just for this situation, but for how our family interacts with the public going forward." Alexander nodded seriously. "I know. But change isn't always bad, especially if it means people can see who we really are instead of who they imagine us to be." Marcus's radio crackled again, and he stepped aside for another update. When he returned, his expression was even more urgent than before. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid we're running out of time to control this narrative. Sky News is now reporting that Palace Security conducted an emergency investigation into the recording, and they're speculating about what could have been so concerning that it required immediate intervention. The implications were devastating. By treating the recording as a security threat, they had inadvertently made it seem far more significant and potentially damaging than it actually was. They're making it sound like Alexander said something dangerous or inappropriate," Victoria said, her voice heavy with regret. "Which is exactly why we need to show them what he actually said," Henry replied, his decision crystallizing. "Alexander, are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" The young prince nodded without hesitation. "Yes, father. But in this case, I'm certain." Henry stood and walked to his son, placing gentle hands on the boy's shoulders. "Then we'll do it together. But we do it properly, with dignity, with honesty, and with respect for the significance of what you're choosing." "What about the protocol team?" Marcus asked weakly. "The communications department? The Queen herself will need to approve such an unprecedented approach," Henry's expression took on the authority of someone who had finally decided to prioritize family over institution. Then we'll get their approval. But we're not going to let speculation and rumor define my son's first real introduction to public scrutiny. If Alexander is brave enough to trust the public with his authentic self, then we need to be brave enough to support him. Victoria felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she realized that her simple desire to preserve a family moment had accidentally triggered something far more significant, a fundamental shift in how the royal family chose to engage with public curiosity about their private lives.
"There's one more thing," Alexander said quietly.
"I want to ask people to be kind when they talk about other children, too, because everyone deserves to have space to play and imagine without worrying that someone will make fun of their ideas." The request revealed the depth of Alexander's understanding about his unique position and his instinct to use it for broader good. At 8 years old, he was already thinking about how his actions might affect other children facing similar scrutiny. Henry knelt down to Alexander's eye level, his expression serious but warm. "You know that once we do this, there's no going back to the way things were before. People will have seen and heard who you really are." "Good," Alexander replied simply. "I'm tired of pretending to be someone else." Victoria realized that what had started as her attempt to preserve Alexander's childhood had actually become his first step toward defining his own public identity on his own terms. The recording that she had thought might be destroyed forever would instead become the foundation for a new kind of royal transparency. "When do we make the announcement?" Victoria asked. Henry looked to Marcus, who was already coordinating with the communications team via his tablet. "If we're going to get ahead of the speculation, we need to move quickly. Can we be ready for a statement within the hour?" "Your Royal Highness," Marcus replied, "with respect, an hour is barely enough time to arrange the technical aspects, let alone prepare Prince Alexander for such an unprecedented media appearance." "I don't need to be prepared," Alexander said firmly. "I just need to be myself." As Victoria watched her grandson demonstrate a courage and wisdom that defied his years, she realized that her controversial recording had accomplished something she never could have planned. It had forced their family to confront the artificial barriers between their public and private selves, and in doing so, it had given Alexander the opportunity to choose authenticity over protocol. The 8-year-old who had started the day building castles and telling stories about dragon knights was about to become the youngest royal in history to speak directly to the nation about the importance of truth, courage, and the right of all children to have space for imagination and growth. "Are we really going to let him do this?" Victoria asked Henry quietly. "We're not letting him do anything," Henry replied, his voice filled with pride and trepidation in equal measure. "We're supporting his choice to be brave enough to be himself in public. And maybe, in the process, we're finally learning how to be authentic royals in a modern world." As Marcus began coordinating the unprecedented media response, and Alexander returned to his position by the window, no longer a child trying to escape adult complications, but a young person preparing to face them with remarkable courage, Victoria realized that what she had thought might be the destruction of her precious recording had actually become its most perfect fulfillment. The moment of authentic childhood joy she had tried to preserve was about to be shared with the world, not as a stolen glimpse behind palace walls, but as a gift freely given by a brave young prince who understood that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is trust others with the truth of who you really are.